There is no one-size-fits-all or a simple fix when it comes to your well-being. Hi, my name's Josephine, founder of Positivity Center and well-being consultant, and a person figuring out how to be my best. So join me in conversation with friends, sharing what works for them, and then listen to what works for others so you can create something that will work for you. Well, hello and welcome to the show, Wellbeing Networks. I am your host, Josephine Tite, and today I am joined by a very interesting person that I've just met, actually. I've done a show with people I've met or know, and this is the first show I've ever recorded with someone I don't know, but somebody I have a lot in common with. So I'd just like to introduce you to Stephen Trisik. Hello and welcome.
Josephine, thanks for having me on the show. It's my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do that brings you to have a discussion with me about well-being.
Sure. So I'm a physician scientist, which is code for research nerd. I'm the chair of medicine at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University and chief of medicine at Cooper University Healthcare. So we're in Camden, New Jersey in the US. And I am an intensivist by background, so a specialist in intensive care medicine, which has been sort of an interesting job over the last couple of years, as you can imagine. I am, for the first 15 years of my career, I was focused on something called resuscitation science. So I was studying brain injury after cardiac arrest in the ICU. And over the last few years, I've pivoted the research program to study the science of human connection. And in the first iteration of that work, which we call compassionomics, we studied the effects of compassion on patients, on patient care, and on those who care for patients. And then more recently, we've been discovering, just uncovering and curating all the evidence for a new project that we just published, or we're just publishing right now. And we call that project Wonder Drug. The subtitle for the book is 7 Scientifically Proven Ways That Serving Others is the Best Medicine for Yourself. And so in that work, we've curated all the evidence that serving others, altruism, helping, giving, kindness, for example, they're actually beneficial for you in not just meaningful ways, but measurable ways. So beneficial for your physical health, your mental health, your happiness, well-being, fulfillment, even your professional success.
Yeah, it's just, it resonates with the research that I've read. I remember studying altruism when I was doing my positive psychology diploma program. And that I used to call it a double lollipop is what I called it, because I felt like you were giving something sweet away, but it was also something sweet for you on the other end. But so I kind of
love it.
Yeah, it's a double lollipop. It's good for
double lollipop. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, you might have to use that. I'm going to use that in my book too, as kind of a sub chapter heading, if you will, because I just think that when we can frame it that way, not necessarily that that's the driver, that we're doing it for ourselves only, right? But we are doing for others, but at the same time we're receiving. So yeah, share us a little bit about that and maybe some of the research that you found that you're going to be putting in the book. A good nugget for somebody if they haven't, dived into the book yet.
Sure. So several years back, after working in the ICU for almost 20 years, I became keenly aware that I had every symptom of burnout myself. Now, of course, you don't have to be a frontline healthcare worker or ICU worker to go through burnout, especially not in 2022. But I looked through the evidence, and much of it was saying things like, take vacations, take walks in the park, take nature hikes, put on your earphones and block out the world, do your Headspace app and all that stuff, which are good ideas, but I wasn't buying it because it was like escapism. And really, after going through all the scientific evidence, what we found is that compassion for others can be a powerful, beneficial therapy for the giver too. And so I decided to test the compassion hypothesis for myself in the throes of burnout. Very intentionally, I did what I call my N of 1 experiment, meaning I was the only one study subject in the paper or in the study. And I decided very intentionally to care more, not less, lean in rather than pulling back, connect more rather than detach. And that was when the fog of burnout began to lift for me. And after we wrote that in Compassionomics and shared it widely, many other people were sharing stories with Anthony Mazzarelli and I, my co-author, and we became aware of all these other stories. And one of my favorite quotes from Brene Brown is, "Stories are just data with a soul." So we had all these data that other people had the same experience, that connecting more and giving more, not less, was a key to their recovery from burnout and building resilience. And it led us to realize that this can't just be true for healthcare workers. There's just no way, right? It has to be a universal. So we went on another journey through the evidence, a year-long journey through the evidence, where we curated over 250 original science research papers showing very compelling signal in the data that serving others is in fact the best medicine for yourself. It benefits your physical health, your mental health, your well-being, fulfillment, even professional success. And so after we curated all that evidence, we had to write about it again. And that's where the book Wonder Drug came from.
I love that because, usually when I speak a lot to caregivers, so people that are specifically in the caring industry, and the talk is always, implement self-care, 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 self-care. And I kind of feel like, even though I haven't dug into the research as much as you have, if the self-care thing was going to work to help, alleviate or even prevent burnout, that it would have worked by now. But, it hasn't. And so I'm just so glad that there's other research out there showing some other ways to. So can you share an example? Is there something that you've heard either from, the qualitative soul stories that you have, or even from your own experience of what it's like to lean in, right, rather than retreat? Like what specifics happened around that in situational real life?
So first of all, to your comment about self-care, well, self-care is very important, but we just have to understand what the most effective self-care actually is. So a NIH supported survey study, it studied self-care currently and compared it to years past. And what it found is that right now, people's self-care are more and more becoming solitary pursuits. So
yeah, that's true.
putting on the headphones, going off on your own, going more deeply withinward.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in times past, decades past, for example, people found solace in relationships. They found solace in family. They found solace in friends. They didn't find solace in putting on their headphones and doing a meditation app. That was not how it worked. And so what the evidence shows quite clearly, and we put quite a bit of this evidence. And so although it's a science book, we tell it in a story that's very relatable and very accessible. We share the evidence that the key to resilience is relationships. And that's super important. So I'll say it again. So the key to resilience is relationships. So that's been found throughout the psychology domain for the general population. It's also been true. It's also true in caregiver roles. But the key to resilience is relationships. And I think that's why my burnout began to lift when I leaned in and started being a better lift to giver, as we say, as Dr. Maz and I say, because my relationships got better for it. And so relationships are important, and self-care as solitary pursuits, I don't think they're just overrated. I think they're potentially really potentially risky, because isolation really drives a lot of anxiety, depression. Connection is better for sure.
Yeah. And did your research help you, in those 2 really heavy years of the COVID situation that we all had to go through, and especially sort of in your field?
Yeah. So I saw just incredible heroism from my colleagues. And so I want to be clear, out of respect for everyone we've lost, there's nothing good that came out of this pandemic. But although nothing good came out of it, there are some things that came out of it that will be helpful to me going forward. And one of the terms, and we write about it in Wonder Drug, it's called elevation. So this is a concept that was the most research has been done by Jonathan Haidt, and it's an emotional state of uplift when you bear witness to another person's heroism, courage, extreme compassion, moral excellence. You get that feeling in your chest when you bear witness to that. And importantly, what happens, research connects elevation with more giving behaviors. And so it makes you a better live to giver, so to speak. And there are all kinds of benefits from that, from serving others. So elevation is something that I'll always take with me, even though, it was a dark 2 years, and, we lost a lot. The way their heroism gave me elevation, just bearing witness to it, made me want to be better.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'll take with me.
Did you find that it was something you had to intentionally look for and notice, or was it just obvious, the elevation?
Here at Cooper, we take care of the sickest of the sick. And so we're a regional referral center for critically ill patients anyway. That was certainly true during the pandemic. And there was such a large scope and depth of critical illness. It was so overwhelming that there was nothing subtle about it. Every day I witnessed heroism in our ICU, in all the areas that we had to create into new ICU spaces because we ran out of ICU beds. But no, there was nothing subtle about it. It was front and center every single day.
Yeah, that's great. Because I know sometimes when I work with caregivers, there is a tendency to not necessarily see the receiving that, when you give care, that you are receiving in some way, shape, or form, but it's not always noticeable. And it's when it becomes noticeable that it becomes something that nourishes your own soul as well. So that's why I asked, because it's got to be something you see and notice. Otherwise it goes unnoticed. And then, right, it's not part of your awareness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in Compassionomics, you talk about the difference between empathy and compassion. And I really would love to spend a little bit of time there.
Sure.
They're not the same. They are different. And one leads to the other. So please share.
So most researchers define compassion this way: an emotional response to another's pain or suffering involving an authentic desire to help. So it is distinctly different from a closely related word, empathy. So empathy is the sensing, detecting, feeling, and understanding another person's pain or suffering. But compassion goes beyond empathy because it involves taking action to help to whatever extent is possible. Now, of course, empathy is vital, because if you don't detect, sense, feel, understand, you'll miss it completely. You'll never see the opportunity to respond with compassion. So empathy is vital, but compassion goes beyond empathy. You can think of it like this: empathy plus action equals compassion.
Yeah. I love that.
And there are neuroscience data to support these distinctions in terms. So it's not just semantics. So for example, using functional MRI brain scans, research shows that when you bear witness to suffering, so you have the empathy side of it, it hits you in the pain center of the brain. That part of the brain is activated, but a distinct neural structure, not the pain center, it's actually a reward center of the brain, is activated when your mind is focused on a helping opportunity. And that's a reward center of the brain that is associated with positive affect, positive emotion, feelings of affiliation. It's part of the reason why it feels good to help people. And then experientially, we also know that it hurts to bear witness to suffering. It's very uncomfortable. And so there is there are neuroscience data behind the saying, I feel your pain, but there are also neuroscience data to support that while empathy hurts, compassion heals. And that's why we advocate compassion for people, because it's not just a feel-good phenomenon. It has all sorts of additional benefits for you. So when people talk about compassion fatigue, I really think they have empathy fatigue, because when you take action and you're able to see that you're able to alleviate another person's pain or suffering to some extent, it changes the experience entirely.
Totally. And so when I heard that, when I first of all read that and then hearing you speak it again, that's mind blowing to me, because I understand the reward centers and the pain centers of the brain and where you want to be lighting up more often. So what's the risk then if we don't learn how to take empathy towards compassionate action and actually take action? Is there one?
So as we move from empathy to compassion, I think the key is looking for those opportunities to help. So I'm just reminded of a story. Just recently, I was in the ICU and I had an especially busy day, meaning people they're always critically ill. But it was a really rough day in the ICU. And I had a gentleman who I was able to get the breathing tube out of his mouth, get him off the ventilator. He was able to breathe on his own. But I knew his diagnosis, he knew his diagnosis, and we both knew that it was not something that was treatable. That can be very frustrating. Of course it is for patients, no doubt, that's obvious, but also for caregivers, because you get that feeling like you can't really make a difference. And it's part of the burnout syndrome, by the way, feeling like you can't make a difference. And so in that sense, you can have empathy, because you see, here was a very weak man off of the ventilator. He looked like he was suffering to a great extent. And so it's not only frustrating that I can't fix his underlying problem, it's also just, I'm surrounded by that suffering, and that can take a toll. And then I would call that empathy fatigue. So you got to look for your opportunities to help. So you have to ask the right questions. So the question today isn't, I can't cure his underlying problem, but how can I make you more comfortable today? Is there anything I can do to make your day better? And he said, well, actually, I can't get the spoon up to my mouth to eat my eggs.
Which leads to the action.
Yes. So I helped him eat his eggs. And at the end, he looked like he really enjoyed it. And he said, thank you. And I could tell he really meant it, because it was meaningful for him, because there really wasn't anything else that he wanted in that moment. And I remember the med students saying to me, like, or at least kind of talking to themselves and then saying to me later in the day, Dr. T, we have other people that can feed people their eggs. You're the chair of the department. You don't need to be doing that. And I said, you guys don't get it. That was the only way I could feel like I could do something for him that made a difference. So I know, yes, it was all about him, because it has to be sincerely about the other person. Sure. But it was the only way that I felt I didn't feel powerless that day in his caring. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So for you, then what's that experience like, walking away from a connection with somebody like that, even though you did something that's not part of your job description? Right? I mean, in the technical way it is, but
it's about just looking for opportunities. And so, by the way, you don't have to be a frontline health care person. You got people in your own orbit all the time that need your help, and right in your own home or in your neighborhood or maybe in your workplace. And we need to keep our eyes open for those opportunities to help and to serve. And what we found in our research for Wonder Drug is that, and this is really key, because the not only is the evidence that serving others is the best medicine for yourself evidence-based, as I said, over 250 research papers are cited in the back of the book, but also we give you an evidence-based prescription. So it's not just what we think or what we believe, but what we found in our journey through the evidence. And the first one is start small. So you might, when we share the principle of Wonder Drug with people, they often think, oh, that sounds great. And, later on in life, when I retire, I'm going to be a better lived giver. And listen, you don't need a total life upheaval. You just need a simple prism change. So you don't need to quit your job and sell all your possessions and move to a third world country and start, hauling water from a distant well. There are people in your orbit every single day. Actually, research from the University of Toronto shows that in everyday life, regular people have 9 empathy opportunities per day on average. So there are people in our orbit every day that are in need of our help, whether we are aware of it or not. We have to look for those opportunities because we can start small. It's just a prism change. It's just it's a mindset shift, a personal paradigm shift, if you will.
Yeah.
Where our personal paradigms are often, it's all about us. And that's sort of how we're sort of, thought, that's how we are often trained over time or led to believe it's all about us, when it's not. It's actually with a personal paradigm shift for helping and serving other people and looking for those opportunities just all around you, not a life upheaval, just changing your outlook on life in your personal paradigm.
I know when I was reading some of your work in Compassionomics, because I haven't read the new book yet, it did kind of a parallel for me anyways, because of my learning to Barbara Fredrickson's work on the broaden and build theory. And so I'm kind of wondering, is it necessary that you put yourself in a positive affect or positive emotional state in order to see those opportunities? Or what other tips do you give people to be able to see those empathic opportunities that can turn into compassionate action?
So sometimes, and this is, we actually wrote about this in Wonder Drug. There's a concept called emotional labor. Emotional labor. And it was really started in industries like luxury hotels and customer call-in centers and, customer assistance centers and things like that. And it relates to when you have to meet somebody in a moment when they're in a lot of distress or they need help, or how do you get there, right? And it's not about faking it. There was actually a paper on this in JAMA, one of the most prominent medical journals, on emotional labor for doctors. And the message was, don't fake it, of course, because that's just like surface acting. But they had this concept that they called deep acting. And what they were describing is like, if anybody has a theater background, like the concept of method acting, where method actors get, like Daniel Day-Lewis or Heath Ledger in The Joker, right? So like they get so into their character, they literally become their character. Their emotional state becomes the character. And it's because they just very intentionally got there somehow, right? So similarly, at the end of a long day, when I'm practicing in the ICU, or perhaps when you're at home. So let's say you have little kids at home, for those of us who have little kids. And if you have little kids at home, you get home after a long day and you're totally wiped out. Maybe you're stressed about work, you're stressed about paying the bills, you're stressed about this, you're stressed about that. But you get home late and your little kid wants it to be story time. And usually parents recognize the imprint that they make on their children and how important that is, right? And so they, when they go into story time mode, they switch off all of that stress that they walk through the door with, right? The stressful day, the paying the bills, the busyness, all that stuff. And they speak to their kid in soothing tones, in allaying any fears that they might be experiencing at that time. And it's not faking, it's love, right? It's just that you had to very intentionally get there because it's so important to your kid, right? And so similarly, at the end of a really long day, and I have a colleague who's a cardiologist who has every day is a very busy day because he's a very popular cardiologist, and he's got long waits to see him because he's not only brilliant technical cardiologist, he also takes care of people the right way. And so what he does is that he, no matter how busy the office has been, how tired is he at the end of the day, his cue is that when he puts his hand on the doorknob to turn the doorknob to go in to see the patient, he reminds himself, now he's been doing it for decades and decades, so it's subconscious. He reminds himself that that patient has been potentially waiting to see him, for months.
Yeah.
And so his only job then is to make that person feel, no matter if they've been waiting or whatnot, to make them feel like they're the only person in the world right then, right? And he has to get there very intentionally, right? So we can summon emotion. And it doesn't have to be faking. It just has to be intentional. So whether you need to have a mindfulness moment to center yourself before you go into the room or whatnot, the concept of emotional labor is really important because, but it's not faking.
Yeah.
That's the point.
So a cue to remember it, or even a, quick visualization of the last time you felt a particular emotion would be helpful in those
Sure.
situations. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that leads me to sort of the last sort of topic I want to make sure we cover, which is the skills that are required to build empathy and compassion. Because of course, for many, many years, it was believed that you were either born with empathy or you weren't. And
Mhm.
I've heard it even in my own work. I've worked with organizations where I'm talking to an educator and she's like, nope, people are either empathetic or they're not. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's a skill
Sure.
that could be developed. So
Yeah.
obviously, and
So,
you're sharing that in that example as well, right?
yeah. So
Yeah.
to be fair, many researchers in that space believe that it's about 30% of your capacity to care for others is in fact genetic, if you
Okay.
will. But the corollary to that is that means 70% is not.
Yeah.
So what the evidence shows quite clearly, and this is both inside the healthcare domain. My group has done research on this, for example, also outside the healthcare domain, just in the general population. The research shows quite clearly that compassionate behaviors can in fact be learned.
Mm-hmm.
And that is good news for me indeed, because I am definitely a work in progress. And thankfully, science shows that I can in fact get better. The key to it is believing in the malleability of empathy and compassion. And so I think the most work that's been done on this has been by Dr. Jamil Zaki and Dr. Carol Dweck at Stanford University, who have studied the malleability of empathy. And Dr. Dweck, for example, in the domain of education, has found that growth mindset is something that profoundly helps kids achieve success in education, where they believe their intelligence is a collection of skills. It's not a trait. Well, what a lot of people don't know about Dr. Dweck's work is that she and her colleagues also studied empathy.
Mm.
And what they found is that a growth mindset also applies.
Yeah.
So basically, if you believe that you can get better, you can get better.
Yeah.
If you believe it's a trait, then you never will put in the work to get better, especially when empathy is hard.
Yeah.
And sometimes, let's face it, empathy is sometimes hard.
Yeah.
So having a growth mindset and believe that empathy and compassion are collections of skills rather than traits, if you know the evidence behind it, and we summarize it in Wonder Drug, that empathy is something that you can actually grow in, and compassion is something you can grow in. Serving others is something you can grow in. You can actually slowly over time, with great intentionality, become what we call a live to giver.
Yeah.
And when you're aware that you can, and it's a collection of skills, not a trait that you're born with, you'll put in the work. And on average, the people who believe that will get better over time and will reap all the rewards of serving others when it becomes a habit that is hardwired into your daily life.
Yeah, exactly. And I can attest to that actually from a personal experience too, because I recall in 2016 taking a strengths profile as part of my program and learning. And I'm also a strengths profile practitioner. And when I took my very first survey, what came up as weaknesses were empathy and compassion, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an intense desire to want to shift that. And so I was willing to not only put in, I already had the mindset that it could be shifted, but I had an intense desire to also connect it to a strength of mine. And I did. I connected it to relationships because I remember I had just, a friend of mine had lost somebody she loved dearly. And I actually noticed that we drifted because I just froze. I didn't know how to be empathic or compassionate with her. And so I learned that over time, I would just use my skill of relationship, and it didn't really matter what action I took, as long as I was taking that action out of love and empathy for somebody, that it would be okay. And they aren't weaknesses anymore on my strengths profile. I've never seen them show up again. So that's just my own, I'm N number one too, right?
So I shared my N of one story in recovery from burnout, and your N of one story in raising your game in compassion for others. That's awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you for just spending the time to share your stories and your research. And I really look forward to reading your new book. And I hope that every person who views this show decides that they can be their own N as well. Their N number one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. Thanks for listening to Wellbeing That Works. Before you go, take 1 minute to write down your takeaway from today's guest. And be sure to download our Wellbeing Evaluation Sheet to help you along your wellbeing journey. And if you've got something to share to inspire others, be sure to be a guest on our show. Until next time, with love and kindness.